The air in the narrow defile between the woods of Tramecourt and Agincourt was cold and heavy with the promise of rain. It was the dawn of October 25th, 1415, and the field was a sea of churned, viscous mud. On one side stood the resplendent flower of French chivalry. 20,000 men-at-arms and knights, their polished plate armor gleaming dully under the leaden sky. They were the undisputed masters of European warfare, the heirs to 1,000 years of martial tradition centered on the lance, the sword, and the heavily armored knight. Arrayed against them was a pathetic, shivering, and desperate remnant, the army of King Henry V of England. Numbering no more than 7,000 men, they were ravaged by dysentery, starving after a long and futile campaign, and hundreds of miles from the safety of the English coast. Their only hope, their only chance of survival, lay with 5,000 men who were not considered soldiers at all in the eyes of their enemies. They were the Longbowmen. This is the story of how these men, armed with 6-foot staves of yew wood, did not just win a battle. They annihilated an army and changed the face of war forever. To understand the cataclysm of Agincourt, one must first understand the profound disparity between the two forces. King Henry V had invaded France weeks earlier with a bold, some said arrogant, claim to the French throne. His primary objective was the port of Harfleur. The siege, however, was a brutal affair. The town resisted stubbornly, and a vicious outbreak of dysentery, the bloody flux, swept through the English camp. Men died not by French steel, but by their own uncontrollable bodily functions, wasting away in their own filth. By the time Harfleur finally capitulated, Henry's army was a ghost of its former self. Of the original 12,000 men who had landed, only around 6,000 to 7,000 remained fit enough to carry a weapon. The strategic situation was dire. Winter was approaching, and the French were gathering a massive army to crush this impudent invasion. Henry's only logical move was a desperate dash to the English-held port of Calais, 120 miles to the north. The march was a nightmare. The French shadowed the English column, systematically destroying bridges and forcing them into long, exhausting detours. They were herding the sick and weary English army, letting fatigue and hunger do their work for them. The French commanders, Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut, were experienced soldiers. They understood that Henry's force was on the brink of collapse. Their own army, by contrast, was a magnificent spectacle of feudal power. It was a veritable who's who of the French nobility. Dukes, counts, and barons from across the land had answered the call, each bringing their own retinues of knights and men-at-arms. This was not a unified professional force. It was a collection of proud, rivalrous aristocrats, each vying for personal glory and honor. They were the political and military elite of the most powerful kingdom in Europe, and they viewed the bedraggled English army with utter contempt. The core of the French army was its heavy cavalry and dismounted men-at-arms, all clad in the finest full-plate armor Milanese armorers could produce. This armor was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, capable of deflecting most sword blows and lance strikes. In their ideology, war was a noble pursuit, a contest between gentlemen of high birth. The outcome of a battle was decided by a crushing, head-on charge of these armored behemoths. The English army, in their view, was an insult to this tradition. Of Henry's 7,000 men, only about 1,000 were men-at-arms, the English equivalent of the French knights. The rest, the overwhelming majority, were archers. In the rigid social and military hierarchy of France, archers were peasants, low-born commoners who fought from a distance. They had no place in the chivalric code. To the French knights, they were not worthy opponents. They were targets, to be ridden down and slaughtered without a second thought. This arrogance, this deeply ingrained hubris, was the first and most critical French mistake. As the rivers swelled from the autumn rains, Henry found his path to Calais blocked. He was forced to turn and fight near the small castle of Agincourt. The situation seemed hopeless. His men were outnumbered by at least 3-1, and many were still weak from sickness. Surrender was the expected outcome. But Henry V was no ordinary commander. He was a master strategist, with a keen eye for terrain and a profound understanding of his army's unique strengths. He would not surrender. He would force the French to fight on a battlefield of his own choosing, a battlefield that would neutralize their every advantage. The field at Agincourt was perfect for his purposes. It was a freshly plowed strip of land, perhaps 1,000 yards wide, squeezed between two dense woods. These woods acted as natural funnels, preventing the massive French army from deploying its full width. The French numerical superiority was instantly nullified. They could not outflank the English. They had to come straight at them. And the ground itself had become a character in the drama. The night-long rain had turned the freshly turned earth into a deep, cloying quagmire. For the heavily armored French knights, this mud would be as deadly as any weapon. Henry deployed his tiny force with brilliant, ruthless efficiency. In the center, he placed his 1,000 men-at-arms, standing 4 deep. They were his anvil. But the true hammer, the operational heart of his entire plan, were the 5,000 longbowmen. He divided them into 2 great wedges, or hearses, and placed them on the flanks, angled forward so they could unleash a devastating crossfire into the French ranks. And then he gave the order that would prove decisive. Every archer was to take a 6-foot-long stave of wood, sharpen it at both ends, and hammer it into the ground at an angle before his position. This created a makeshift but lethal defensive palisade, a forest of death pointing toward the enemy. It was a simple, ingenious innovation, born of necessity and a clear understanding of the threat posed by cavalry. The French camp, meanwhile, was a scene of chaos and boastful confidence. Their command structure was a shambles. There was no single, unquestioned authority. Instead, there was a council of proud nobles, each a commanding officer in his own right, each arguing for the honor of leading the vanguard. The Constable d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut, professional soldiers, likely argued for caution. They understood the power of the longbow and the perils of the muddy ground. But their counsel was drowned out by the younger, hotter-headed nobles. These men, like the Duke of Orleans and the Duke of Bourbon, were desperate for glory. They scoffed at the English position. They saw a band of starving men and low-born archers hiding behind pointed sticks. In their view, a single, overwhelming frontal assault by the flower of French chivalry would simply roll over the English line. The battle would be over in minutes. It was a catastrophic failure of intelligence and a stunning display of strategic arrogance. They were planning to fight the battle they wanted to fight, not the battle that Henry V was forcing upon them. For hours, the two armies stood watching each other across the field. Henry, in a bold move to provoke the French into attacking, ordered his entire army to advance forward several hundred yards until they were just out of extreme crossbow range. They stopped, reset their stakes, and stood in silence. This was an incredible psychological gambit. A starving, outnumbered army was not cowering in defense, it was taking the initiative. It was a direct insult to French honor. The French, predictably, took the bait. The order was given. The battle began not with a general advance, but with a limited cavalry charge. A few hundred mounted knights, the elite vanguard of the French army, spurred their massive destrier war horses forward. Their mission was clear: to crash into the English archer formations on the flanks, scatter the rabble, and clear the way for the main infantry assault. It was a textbook tactic, but the textbook had not accounted for the mud of Agincourt. The charge immediately began to slow as the horses, each carrying a man in full armor, sunk into the quagmire. Their momentum, the very source of their power, was stolen by the sucking, clinging earth. Then they reached the stakes. The sharpened wood, invisible until the last moment, formed an impenetrable barrier. Horses screamed as they impaled themselves. Riders were thrown from their saddles, only to be crushed by the following ranks or trampled into the mud. The charge disintegrated into a tangled, chaotic mess of dying animals and fallen knights. And then King Henry gave the signal. The sky, already dark with clouds, turned black with something else. It was not a rain of water, but a storm of wood and steel. 5,000 longbowmen, in a display of discipline and power that must have seemed supernatural to the French, drew their bowstrings to their ears. The English longbow was not a simple hunting weapon. It was the most devastating personal projectile weapon of the Middle Ages, a true WMD of its era. Crafted from a single 6-foot stave of yew, it had a draw weight of 150 to 180 pounds. To fire it required immense strength, built up over a lifetime of practice. An experienced archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows a minute. The math was terrifying. Over 50,000 arrows were raining down on the French every 60 seconds. The sound was unforgettable, a sinister vrit as thousands of arrows cut through the air at once, followed by the sickening thuds and cracks as they found their marks. These were not simple arrows. The archers used a variety of projectiles, but for armored knights, they employed the bodkin point, a long, square, needle-sharp arrowhead designed for one purpose only: to punch through plate armor. At close range, it could penetrate the best steel a knight wore. Visors were pierced, breastplates were punctured, and the unarmored flanks and backs of horses were shredded. The cavalry charge, already broken by the stakes and mud, was utterly annihilated under this steel-tipped hailstorm. The survivors fled back towards their own lines, spreading panic and disorder. Yet the French high command, in its hubris, saw the failure of the cavalry not as a warning, but as a minor setback. The order was given for the main assault to proceed. The first and largest wave of French men-at-arms, several thousand strong, dismounted. They believed fighting on foot would be more honorable and would solve the problem of the muddy ground. It was a fatal miscalculation. They began their advance, a solid wall of polished steel, a breathtaking and terrifying sight. But they were advancing directly into the killing zone. Each French knight was carrying 60 to 80 pounds of armor. As they trudged forward, their plate-armored feet sank deep into the mud with every step. It was less a martial advance and more a grueling, exhausting slog. The distance they had to cover was only a few hundred yards, but it must have felt like miles. The entire time, the arrow storm never ceased. The English archers, standing on dry, firm ground, fired with relentless, mechanical precision. They arched their shots to fall on the rear ranks and fired flat, direct trajectories into the front. There was no cover, no respite. Arrows clattered off armor, but others found the gaps at the joints, the armpits, the groin, the visor's sight. Men stumbled and fell, only to be trampled by the men behind them. The sheer volume of projectiles was psychologically shattering. To walk through that, unable to retaliate, watching comrades fall all around, required a courage that borders on madness. By the time the leading French knights finally, miraculously, reached the thin English line of men-at-arms, they were gasping for breath, utterly spent, their strength sapped by the mud and the relentless missile fire. The English men-at-arms, by contrast, were fresh. They had stood their ground, conserving their energy. As the French line made contact, the English met them not as a defensive wall, but with a ferocious, violent counterattack. They used their axes, mallets, and swords with brutal efficiency, hacking and stabbing at the exhausted Frenchmen. The battle in the center devolved into a nightmarish press of bodies, so tight that men could not raise their arms to swing their weapons. They fought with daggers, with their fists, and by wrestling their opponents to the ground, where the mud would suffocate them. It was at this critical moment, with the two lines locked in a desperate shoving melee, that Henry V executed his masterstroke. He gave a new order to his archers. They had exhausted their sheaves of arrows. Now they seized their secondary weapons: hatchets, mallets, swords, and knives. They abandoned their positions and launched a furious flanking assault on the trapped French columns. This was the coup de grace. The lightly armored, agile archers swarmed the flanks and rear of the heavily encumbered French knights. They were like wolves harrying a trapped bear. They slipped through the mud, stabbing and hacking at the vulnerable points of the French armor. They tipped men over who, once down in their heavy plate, were utterly helpless, drowning in the mud or having their throats cut. The French, already exhausted and disorganized, were completely surrounded and slaughtered where they stood. Then the unthinkable happened. The French second line, seeing the carnage, began to advance, but they simply tripped over the mountainous pile of corpses from the first wave, adding to the chaos and becoming easy prey for the English. The field became a single, horrific, suffocating pile of the dead and dying. So many French nobles had been captured for ransom that, at one point, they began to outnumber their English captors. It was then that Henry received reports of a French raid on the English baggage train to the rear. Fearing that this signaled a renewed coordinated attack from the still intact French third line, and knowing he had no men to guard the prisoners, the king made the most controversial decision of his life. He gave the order that all prisoners, save for the most high-ranking and wealthy, were to be executed. It was an act of brutal, cold-blooded pragmatism. English soldiers, reluctant to kill men who could bring them a fortune in ransom, had to be threatened into carrying out the order. It was a massacre upon a massacre, a stark, bloody end to any pretense of chivalry on that field. As the sounds of combat faded, replaced by the moans of the wounded and the calls of crows, the sheer scale of the catastrophe became clear. The French army had been annihilated. Conservative estimates place their dead at between 6,000 and 10,000 men. Among the slain were a significant portion of the French aristocracy. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, was dead. 3 dukes, 5 counts, and over 90 of the great lords of the realm lay dead in the mud. The political and military leadership of France had been decapitated in a single morning. The English losses, by staggering contrast, were perhaps 200 to 400 men, with only a handful of men-at-arms, including the Duke of York, among the dead. The immediate aftermath sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The political fallout in France was devastating. The nation was plunged into a civil war and a crisis of leadership that would last for decades. For England, Agincourt became the legendary cornerstone of national identity, immortalized for all time by William Shakespeare. Henry V returned to London a conquering hero, his authority and prestige at their absolute zenith. He would eventually force the French to sign the Treaty of Troyes, naming him the heir to the French throne. But the legacy of Agincourt is more than just a tale of national glory. It was a paradigm shift in the art of war. It signaled the end of the age of the invincible knight and the dawn of a new era where technology, terrain, and tactical intelligence could triumph over brute force and blind courage. The English longbow, wielded by the common man, had proven itself the master of the aristocratic knight. The battle was a perfect, bloody storm of French hubris, English discipline, and one king's brilliant, ruthless strategy. The mud of Agincourt has long since settled, but the story of that day, when 7,000 men, most of them simple archers, annihilated an army of 20,000, remains one of the most stunning and decisive victories in the history of human conflict. The echoes of the longbows have faded, but the lessons of Agincourt are timeless. If you are captivated by this deep dive into history's most incredible battles, then your journey into the past doesn't have to end here. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. We dissect the strategies, the personalities, and the pivotal moments that shattered empires and changed the world forever. Now we want to hear from you, the commanders of history. What other legendary last stands or impossible victories should we cover next? The Battle of Cannae? The Siege of Vienna? Or was Henry V's decision to execute the prisoners a brutal necessity or a war crime? Let us know your thoughts and verdicts in the comments below. The discussion is just getting started.